Obrigado. E boa tarde. I first of all want to thank the Dos Santos Foundation for the opportunity to speak to you today, but also to thank them for organizing a conference around a topic which I believe to be one of the most important topics that we have as a human population at this moment in history, namely pandemics. How do we understand them, and how do we avoid having the same situation occur in the future? So today I'm going to talk to you about a couple of different topics. I'm going to start off by reviewing some things about the biology and epidemiology of pandemics in general. Then I'm going to talk about some time that I spent working in the field understanding how it is that viruses come from animals into human populations and begin their spread to become pandemics. Then I'm going to talk about three topics aimed at decreasing the risk we have from pandemics in the future. The first one is early warning, scanning the horizon to catch viruses before they spread globally, like COVID-19. A second topic that I'll speak about is understanding viruses, looking out into the animals that viruses come from to understand the diversity of viruses that we face as a future population, and how can we vaccinate against them and create systems to understand and stop them. And then finally, I'm going to be talking about the finance and economic implications of these pandemics and ways that we can use our understanding of viruses to address them. So, one question, and the topic is really, can we prevent future pandemics? And I very much like to think of the topic of a final plague, a last pandemic. And I certainly believe this is something that humanity has the potential to do. Having said that, we are some time away from doing that. That is just the reality. If you look at this, this is the frequency of outbreaks, epidemics, and pandemics over time. These things are increasing dramatically. They're a feature of our future. It doesn't mean that there's nothing we can do about them, but I think our experience with COVID-19 has shown us that we have a tremendous amount of work to do. This is one way to think about these viruses and to sort of understand why we're at such risk and why the frequency of these viral infections is increasing. So this is an image which shows flights from about 100 years ago and sometime right now. And I think it's very easy for us to forget how dramatically the world has changed over the past decades. We are now in a world that's gone to 7 billion individuals, with flights that are connecting everywhere in the world all of the time, with massive animal populations and domestic animals, more chickens by some estimations than wild birds. And this is a world in which we have exquisite risk for these kinds of pandemics. Now, this is how, as a biologist, as an epidemiologist, we really think about the process of pandemics. Normally, people think about pandemics up here, something like a COVID-19 or an HIV, but the reality is viruses have a number of stages to go through before they actually become pandemics that are endemic to the human population, say like seasonal influenza or COVID-19. All of these viruses start in wild animal populations, and there's a huge diversity of wild animal viruses that are out there. Now, individuals have contact with these wild animals in a number of different ways, whether it be spending time in habitats where they exist, whether it be by hunting and butchering, whether it be by mosquitoes. Humans at the very front line are getting infected constantly by these viruses, and this is what we think of as viral chatter. Only a few of these viruses really go on to be transmitted and to even actually get into humans, let alone be transmitted. And even those that actually do become transmissible, most of them are not human adapted and do not exist within our domestic animals. And only really at the very end of this process do we find viruses that are endemic to human populations. And I'll provide an example of that, which is when we think about the HIV/AIDS crisis, and its beginnings, we'll often think back to the 1980s. This is the time that most of the world really became familiar with this virus. Having said that, we now know a tremendous amount about the origins of HIV. And this is a virus that had infected individuals crossed from chimpanzees to humans, as we'll talk about, likely through hunting and butchering of non-human primates, of monkeys and apes in forested areas, before the Great Depression. So this is a virus that existed in human populations for many, many decades and was going along that pyramid of adapting into human populations. And my early work as a scientist was really about trying to understand that process and to see if, by understanding it, we could get ahead of it and try to avoid crises like the HIV/AIDS crisis or the COVID crisis. So, as a postdoctoral researcher at Johns Hopkins University, I was quite a naive young scientist working with an excellent virologist, Don Burke, went on to become the dean of the School of Public Health at University of Pittsburgh. And Don, for many years, had thought that hunting and butchering was likely important for the origins of HIV. And this was something that, as a doctoral student, I had attempted to understand the viruses of wild apes, wild chimpanzees, and wild gorillas in an attempt to document how they evolve. And so we decided together to start a research project in Central West Africa, which, based on the diversity of the many different kinds of HIV that were present in human populations, suggested that that was likely the location where the virus crossed over from animals into people. And again, I was a bit naive. I really had not spent a tremendous amount of time doing field work, certainly not in Central Africa. But we basically said, hey, we'll pick these sites and we'll look at animals and human populations and we'll attempt to document this process of how a virus is emerging into humanity. Now, of course, when I got to the site, this was a little bit more of what I found. And it was frankly very, very difficult. And of course, most of the work was done by my Cameroonian and Congolese colleagues. But during the 10 years that I spent working intensively in Cameroon and other West and Central African countries, a great deal of progress was made on the infrastructure to be able to really understand and study these kinds of viruses in a wild setting. And I'll just show a few images from the field work that I conducted. Again, this was in the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s, and some of my colleagues from Cameroon. I'll show you images kind of early on in that process and later on the process. When I arrived, it was still the case that the only primary way that you could maintain a cold chain in order to preserve specimens, in order to do these studies, was actually to get dry ice from breweries which produce carbon dioxide as a byproduct. Over time, the laboratories in many parts of Central Africa now have liquid nitrogen generators and the capacity to freeze specimens in a remarkably long-term and stable way. When we started, this was what the laboratory looked like. And now we have a laboratory which is fully functioning, fully run by the Cameroonian scientists and the Cameroonian government, capable of detecting viruses from a huge number of different viral families, really the majority of viruses that humans have to be concerned with, certainly the ones that we're aware of. And finally, I'll just show you an image of myself as a younger scientist when I first arrived in Cameroon. This is my colleague, my late colleague, Colonel Mpudi Ngole, who was sort of the head of the military health infrastructure in Cameroon and was an early pioneer in this work and in developing the site. Now this is the after shot of me after about 10 years. That's me second from right. So the changes occurred in a number of different ways. And also, this is just to show you on the far left-hand side is Don Burke, who was my mentor. And on the right side is Ubal Tamofe, who's really my colleague and who now runs the program in Cameroon and really all throughout Central and West Africa. Okay, so just again, returning to this topic of where these viruses come from, I'm going to show you this early work that I did was really, again, focused on this point of viral chatter. And in other words, what we were doing is understanding the diversity of viruses in animal populations and monitoring individuals who we thought had high risk of contracting novel viruses from animal populations. And please excuse these images, but the reality is people everywhere in the world hunt local game. It is just the nature of our species. It's the nature of populations, whether they be in Texas or California. I'm not sure how much hunting occurs in Portugal, but I assume there's some hunting here in Portugal. Many populations around the world are still dependent upon wild animals as a source of protein, as a source of income. And this provides also for viruses, when we think about it from the perspective of the virus, it provides an opportunity for the virus to enter into the human population. And so this was the hypothesis we started with when we began this work in Central Africa, was that we could look at individuals who were right at this interface, and perhaps we would see viruses that were crossing over into them. And I won't spend a tremendous amount of time on it, but I will present one summary slide where we were actually able to demonstrate just this. So we worked with a group of individuals who hunted monkeys and apes, as well as certainly other animals in very rural, forested areas within Central Africa. And there was this interesting virus called simian foamy virus. Now, for us, this was a really perfect model virus to look at, to study the origins, the emergence of new viruses for the following reasons. Number one, it's a retrovirus. So it's in the same family as HIV. And because we know that just like COVID, SARS, MERS, or the influenza viruses, we know that retroviruses are a group of viruses that can cross into humans and lead to devastating consequences. And so the other thing that's very interesting about foamy viruses is that virtually every monkey and ape species has their own version of this virus. And if you look at the tree of viruses, the evolutionary tree of these viruses, and the evolutionary tree of monkeys and apes, they're mirror images of each other. In other words, over time, as these monkeys and apes evolved, the viruses within them evolved as well. Now, interestingly, humans are one of the only primate species that lack a simian foamy virus. And we don't know exactly why that is. We think one of the reasons, perhaps, is that we're one of the only primate species that as adults don't bite each other. So that's maybe one explanation for it, but we don't really know the answer. But what it provided us with is the capacity to look at individuals who had contact with these monkeys and apes, and if we found a virus in those people, we would know exactly which animal it came from. So we could look at the behavior, and we could look at the virology of these hunters and people who were butchering wild game, and if we found something, we could determine what it was. And so we asked detailed questions about hunting history, and of course we had this background of knowing about these viruses. Well, to make a long story short, this is the evolutionary tree of the foamy viruses. These are gorilla viruses. These are viruses from a species of monkey called the mandrill, an old world monkey. And this is from Cercopithecines, like a this is a mandrill, that's a Debrausus guenon. The slides got mixed up. I think that was a test, but I'm happy I caught it. And so what's interesting is this is the evolutionary tree of the viruses. And it also is basically the evolutionary tree of apes and monkeys. And these individuals were three individuals in our study, humans who had hunted, and they each had presence of a different simian foamy virus. And we were able to know exactly which animal those viruses had come from, number one. Number two, we could compare it to the data of self-reporting hunting. And what we identified is it was very rare in our sample, even though people were hunting gorillas, as you can imagine, is a particular task. It's not something that everybody does, even hunters. There was a very small percentage of our population, even our hunting population, that had a history of hunting gorillas. And this was one of those individuals who reported a history of hunting gorillas. And since this work, there's been many other simian foamy-viruses by other studies, as well as other retroviruses that have similarly been documented of crossing over from animals into human populations. Again, this was some of the early work. I thought this might be of interest to look at because it gives a sense of how in the past somebody doing virology or epidemiology thought of this problem of how new viruses emerge and become pandemics. But also because we could identify by monitoring individuals that at that interface new viruses that are crossing over perhaps before they go global, which was a huge problem for slowly evolving and slowly moving viruses like HIV, for example. Now, I was fortunate subsequently to be a part of a large program called the PREDICT program. And this was the fundamental philosophy and evolution of thinking about viruses, which was sort of the next level after that pyramid sort of diagram. And the idea here is that you have natural, constant transmission. So again, we think of humans, but now think back to animal species, all of these animals. Bats and primates and wild bird species, they all have their own viruses. Sometimes they're moving around among animals, and there's a dynamic of how these viruses are moving, and this is just a constant process. Now, occasionally, there is spillover to domestic animals. This is something that happens very commonly in the case of influenza, which is a virus that often goes from wild birds to pigs or ducks before it enters human populations. Not always, but often. And then only at this stage do you really get amplification and transmission in human populations. And the object of this particular philosophy of this work, this PREDICT effort, which was a large effort that it was global in its nature, was to try to move the curve to the left, as we say. In other words, to try to identify these viruses early, to understand them in such a way that helps us to save many, many people and a tremendous amount of damage to economies and global social structures by controlling them early. And this is still, I think, the hope, and these efforts are ongoing, and they're really a surveillance that's increasing all over the world to do this. Now, I thought it might be interesting to show some of the results of this work. The other thing that's important about this work is it went through and documented a diversity of viruses that exist in nature. And right now, you may be familiar with monkeypox. This is an orthopox virus. It's in the same family as smallpox, which was a devastating virus. Now, this is one of those viruses that exists in nature and that studies like this document occasional transmission of monkeypox into human populations. By doing this, we're able to answer questions like, for example, will our smallpox vaccine that we know was very successful at permitting us to eradicate the only virus we ever had in history that was eradicated, namely smallpox, would it be successful for monkeypox? And we know that it is successful for monkeypox. So doing this actually arms us with a set of tools that permit us to anticipate, and part of what this PREDICT study did is to identify viruses in all of these different families that had not been identified before. So this puts these on public health radar. It permits organizations that try to develop universal vaccines against particular groups like coronaviruses to know the diversity of the genetic diversity of the viruses that are present in nature. And so this is, again, one of these scientific foundations that ultimately permits scientists and public health individuals to be able to control and address these kinds of phenomena. And I won't talk too much about this, but it basically just shows that you can also use some of these studies to estimate what's out there. Even if you haven't sampled enough to know all of the viruses out there, you can start to understand and get a sense of what you likely have not yet discovered, which is obviously very helpful when we're talking about a tremendous diversity of viruses out in animal populations. So the first part of my career was really focused on the epidemiological features, the biological features. I'm a biologist by training. I'm a virologist. And this was understanding the birth of these pandemics was something that was deeply critical for me. But of course, there's other important features to these viruses. And there's some things, for example, and we've seen this very, very clearly in the case of COVID. Let's see, I haven't even put COVID on this particular slide. So this was an old slide that didn't even include COVID. And effectively what it reminds us of is that COVID is not unique, and the nature of our contemporary financial and economic systems is such that there's a tremendous potential burden to human populations, not just from the lives lost, which of course is our first priority, but also the economic and financial impact. And this is not something new to COVID-19. It's something that I don't have to communicate now. This was a big part of talks that I gave before COVID-19. Everybody now understands the potential devastation financially and economically. And one of the objectives was to say, can we potentially use our understanding of viruses to anticipate and decrease the financial impact of these kinds of events? And I believe the answer to that to be yes. And so one of the ways that I think about this is insurance. Okay, so many of you, if you were like me before I really started working with people in the insurance industry, you think about insurance perhaps as your life insurance policy, your car insurance policy, your home policy. But there is another part of the insurance industry, a very sophisticated, mathematically intense part of the insurance industry, which attempts to understand global catastrophes, whether they be massive hurricanes or earthquakes, whether they be flooding events or drought. And there's a tremendous amount of progress that's been made by these insurance companies insuring those events. And about 10 years ago, I was approached by somebody within the insurance industry, Gunter Kraut from Munich Re, and he basically said, hey, we think we could potentially do the same effort aimed at pandemics. And again, why insurance is really important is it permits us to pool risk across many different sectors. The impact on the financial sector of COVID was quite different from the impact on the tourist sector, was quite different from the impact on the mining sector, et cetera. And we could potentially pool these in order to spread risk around. And particularly, this is also very critical for smaller events, which we often see. Ebola, SARS, MERS, currently monkeypox, et cetera. So the question is, could we combine our knowledge of how these viruses evolve with some of the more contemporary mathematics around actuarial science around insurance of catastrophic events to come up with insurance mechanism for pandemics? And we did this work before COVID and continue to do it. And I'll tell you, one of the ways that we do this is actually not out in the fields, but or in vivo or in vitro, but in silico. In other words, through modeling within computers. So we now understand enough about these viruses that we can actually simulate future outbreaks based on historical events and based on our knowledge to look to a certain extent to the distribution of future epidemics in such a way that's similar to how it's done for earthquakes and hurricanes. You know, people often say to me, well, can epidemics be predicted? And the answer is, depends on what you mean by prediction. Can hurricanes be predicted? Well, they can't be predicted to know exactly where they're going to occur 3 or 4 years in the future, but the future of hurricanes can be understood well enough to be able to insure against them. And that's why we have hurricane insurance. That's how we have earthquake insurance. And pandemics is a peril that is in the same class. This is something that we can understand features of the likely future about it, and we will improve our models over time. So we created these models. Let's see if I can go back. And put them into a situation where we basically had all of these models pre-computed. And then I just like to show this image to give you a sense of what kind of modeling can be done now. This is what's referred to as an N-Dimensional Hypercube. And the way to think of it is each of these is a parameter in our model. So let's say this first parameter might very well be where a virus emerges in the world. And you can model viruses, again, all in the computer, viruses starting in 100 different countries in the world. And for each of those countries, the next parameter might be how transmissible it is. And so for each of those, you model the transmissibility. Then after transmissibility, it may be how deadly is it? Is there a vaccine, et cetera. So if you imagine this as a multi-dimensional image, it gives you a sense of where we're able to go now in terms of computational capacity to understand hypothetical future events. And this has led to real programs, real projects, of course, not just our work, but the work done by modelers, and these great organizations like the World Bank and African Risk Capacity that have started to create policies which will trigger in such a way that permits countries that may have fewer resources to have immediate resources to put into stopping the early spread of a virus. They can participate in a sovereign insurance pool, for example. And so these are, I think, just the beginning of mechanisms by which we can use this science, not just to catch viruses early, which is absolutely critical, not just to understand the diversity of what's out there in order to be able to have vaccines and treatments that can address them, but also to be able to anticipate, prepare for, and mitigate the financial and economic consequences of future events. And this is an area that I've spent a lot of time over the last 5 years doing, and I'm quite excited by. So again, as we think of these events, I am optimistic. Despite COVID-19 and how devastating it's been, and the weaknesses that it's pointed out, for example, misinformation, fake news. This was something that I didn't fully anticipate prior to COVID-19. I would have imagined that there would have been a safe, efficacious vaccine for a new pandemic, that it would be something that everybody would line up for, that would be very straightforward. It would be shocking for me to have imagined that the anti-vaccination community would actually get stronger during such an event. This is something we couldn't anticipate. Having said that, I think we have the tools that are necessary to understand these events, how they occur. We have the computational power to model them. We have the genetic resources to be able to understand very, very quickly the diversity of these viruses. And so while on the one hand, I am quite concerned about, as we all should be, about the nature of the features increasing risk, connectivity, domestic animal populations, et cetera, I also believe that the tools are quite extraordinary. And so when I think about the future, the way that I like to think about the future is a world in which we may not be able to identify every single one of these boulders or catastrophes that are out there for us to face, but we understand them in such a way that puts us in a safe way. And eventually we could imagine a world where if we took these events seriously enough, not just when they occurred, but before they occurred, and what we call inter-epidemic periods between major epidemics, when we'll largely forget. If we use these opportunities, we really have some strong potential to decrease the chance of future pandemics and make the world a safer place. Thank you very much.